Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. This is Valentina Stramiello from the European Patients Forum speaking. Today we are running another of the patient engagement open forum sessions that will be focused on patient engagement needs in platform trials. And next slide, please. This is going to be one of the last sessions actually for 2021. But just as a reminder for those who are not used to attend patient engagement open forum events, the PEOF is a series of virtual events, at least for 2021, where we will work together in a multi-stakeholder context towards stronger patient engagement. The forum aims to provide a holistic perspective of patient engagement, the landscape and actors, and foster collaboration and co-creation while breaking down fragmentations that are often present in patient engagement work. Next one, please. Before we get started, the usual reminders, I guess you are all used to these rules right now, but we ask you to be present and engaged in the discussion. Keep all microphones muted. Of course, for the audience, it goes by default, but for speakers and panelists, it's up to us to fix this. Provide your questions, comments, and feedback in the Q&A function. The session is going to be recorded. And last but not least, let's make this workshop an interesting one together. Next one, please. All questions will be shown with the name of the person who asked, just as you could comment in a live meeting. So be respectful to others, as you would do in a live meeting. If you see that the questions are already addressed, there's no need for repetitions. Unfortunately, we cannot react to all the questions, but we will try to address as many as we can. Next one, please. This is the agenda for today. So after this short introduction, I will hand over to Matt Seitz, who's Professor of Clinical Trials and Methodology for the Clinical Trials Unit at UCL. After Matt, we will have a second presentation from a colleague of Matt, Nuru Noor, who will discuss uptake of late-phase adaptive platform trials and consideration for committees overseeing data in these trials. If we have any major questions, we will try to address them, and then we will move on with panel discussions. And I will be happy to introduce to you all the panelists when we started the panel itself. And with this, I will leave the floor to Matt with this presentation on Stampede and how platform trials work.
Yeah, good afternoon. Thanks, Valentina. Thanks, everyone, for being here. There's a red line appeared on the slides, so those don't look like my slides. Do we know what's happened to the formatting?
I'm not sure. I just copied them. But let's move on with the next one. Maybe it's just.
Yeah. Okay. Right. Very good. Thank you. It looks like the formatting has changed. Someone's put it into whatever style was there. So what we're trying to say here, to introduce, I've been asked to set the scene for you in platform trials. I'm going to give you the example of one trial and some of the patient needs. Could you take the slides back, please? I don't know why they've moved on. Thank you. So we're setting the scene. I'm going to talk about one trial and some of the patient engagement that we've had, and then Nuru is going to pick up and talk about the broader areas of engagement. So the issue that we've got here is for trials that there are often many approaches worthy of testing, and it can take many years to confirm a clinical benefit, even if there is clinical benefit. And yet the issue is that very often trials find that what is new doesn't actually work better at all. And traditional designs don't cope very well when there's many things worthy of looking at. Could you please go back? Okay, so the traditional design here is that very often people run single-arm phase 2 studies, and things that are interesting will look at phase 3 studies. And you'll end up with competing trials. If we go on to the next slide now, please. So about 20 years ago, our director, Max Palmer, came up with the multi-arm, multi-stage design. And effectively, what you do is wrap up all the things you think are worthy of testing, and you put them into one trial. Okay, if you want to go on, please. And within that, so by wrapping them all up together, you can test many relevant approaches. So if you've got 5 things worthy of testing, which we've represented in the green boxes here, then rather than running 5 separate trials, so you've got 5 comparisons across 10 arms, across 5 separate trials, you wrap them all up together. And so you will see you could have one trial with 6 arms that does all 5 comparisons. This uses fewer resources. Your cost per comparison is going to be much less, and that's important because trials are expensive, they're resource intensive, and there's actually a lot less bureaucracy. The administration behind running clinical trials is not straightforward. So that's a multi-arm element. If we move on to the next slide. So the multi-stage element is to use interim pre-planned lack of benefit analyses to ask if there are reasons to continue to test an approach. So in some trials, you'll stop early if something is very efficacious. You may stop early because there's harm. Actually, this saying is you may see a benefit, but it's such a small benefit, it's not worth continuing to invest in. And so this allows us to move away from things that are insufficiently interesting, and we can take those resources and go and use them to see if we can come up with something that will actually help people in the future. So you can use a few pre-planned looks to stop things that aren't looking interesting enough, stop recruitment of things. If you move on again. And then we drew in, so you could see that as a series of hurdles that need to be jumped, or bars that need to be raised. So let's move on to the next slide. So the platform element really builds on this. You've got protocols effectively that are addressing many questions within this one administrative structure. And the important thing to me about platform is the ability to draw in new questions later on, a kind of a living protocol. And that's quite nice to try to do. It makes sense to do in a multi-arm trial. If I've got a 4-arm trial and I had a 5th arm in, it seems quite intuitive to people. If I'm doing a traditional 2-arm trial and I had a 3rd arm, then it's going to feel like quite a big step. So multi-arm, multi-stage trials lend themselves quite nice as a framework for platform protocols. And overall, they become a platform, a framework, a scaffold, if you like, for building in these comparisons. And you may hear people talk about basket or umbrella trials. It's really thinking about stratified medicine, and it's more relevant in some areas than others. Let's move on to the next slide. So I'm going to talk to you very briefly about the STAMPEDE. This is a trial for patients with metastatic or non-metastatic high-risk prostate cancer who are starting long-term hormone therapy for the first time. The trial was originated by Max, and the chief investigator was Nick James in Birmingham, out at the Institute of Clinical Research, Cancer Research. So when this trial was started up about 20 years ago, there'd been no improvement for these patients for about 40 or 50 years. Long-term hormone therapy was a standard of care. But now there was starting to be a number of things that looked worthy of testing. How do we choose between them? So if we go on to the next slide, I won't go into the full details of this, but what you've got is a scheme showing STAMPEDE. Along the top, along the bottom is time, along the left and the right, you've got the arms of the trial. And it started off with 1 control arm, A, and 5 research arms, arms B to F. So that shows you the multi-arm element. We chose 5 treatment arms worthy of exploring. If you move on to the next slide, we see the multi-stage element when recruitment, green is completed recruitment, orange is future recruitment. At the end of the 2nd interim analysis, the data monitoring committee looked and said, according to your pre-specified levels of interest, we think you should stop recruiting to 2 of the arms that are looking insufficiently interesting. So we stop recruitment to those and continue recruitment to the others. The boxes on the right-hand side are where we're going to be doing the analyses. Let's move on again. The platform element then came in when we added a new comparison later on that same year in November 2011. Doesn't matter what the drug is, but it was looking interesting in later stage cancer and worthy of testing here. You know, we extended out the control arm too. This worked well enough that we did this again. If you move on, and a number of times here. So you can see we've added 5 new comparisons to this particular trial. So this sounds complicated. Let's move on. There's a number of groups that we need to make sure that are on board to get any trial up and running. An important group here, of course, is the potential participants, and this is what I want to focus on today. For a number of clinicians, for regulators, at first are a little bit wary about this approach. Whereas the patient representatives that we had on the trial management group, remember this is 20 years ago, this is before most people had trial management patient representatives on their patient groups, said, why wouldn't you do it like this? They bought into the idea straight away. They liked the idea that actually you had a greater chance of getting allocated to a research arm. And even if you were allocated to the control arm, you were helping more people because you contribute to more comparisons. So they bought into this very early. And we developed a staged patient information sheet that really helped us here. Let's just pick up on this briefly. If you go on a slide. The staging is important because to me, information is like food. We all fill up at different rates. What's enough food for me may not be enough for you, or maybe too much. And it's the same with information. When my father was ill a couple of years ago, he wanted no information at all. But if I was ill, want all of the information. Give me everything that you can give me. If we go on again. So we were used as amongst this. So we structured the information sheets to have these kind of layers to it. There's a general information sheet, and then there are arm-specific information sheets. You get the arm-specific information sheet that you're allocated to, and then you're very welcome to look at the other ones if that's something that you want to see. And you can have them up front, you can have them a little bit later, as long as you've got enough information to make an informed choice that you're joining the trial. And then there's additional separate information about the biomarker studies if you're participating in those. So if we go on again, patient information sheet, we use a format that was proposed by Peter Knapp in York, this column format with quite narrow columns because that's easier to read. There's effectively a cover page with an index, and then you've got the structure, a Q&A format. I don't expect you to be able to read. Let me show you one of the pages. I think we zoom in a bit on the next slide. So you can see our cover page here. You can see a little bit of general overview, and then you've got the contents, the information. And on the left-hand side, what you see at the very end was this table. You'll see something with blue columns. Don't expect you to be able to read it. Blue headings, which is effectively saying, right, these are the other information sheets that we would encourage you to go and read. So if we go on again, I wanted to reflect some information we have from David Matheson. David is one of the patient representatives we have on Stampede at the moment. David's been excellent. He's a lecturer from Wolverhampton and a researcher in other areas. At a recent presentation, David wanted to describe what patient representatives, PPI members of the Stampede TMG do. They sit on the trial management group, and they on various working groups, and they've been involved in prioritizing, defining the questions. This is really important. They have insight, they oversee the trial with us. They sit on the trial management group. They contribute to the interpretation of the results and the dissemination. They've co-authored abstracts, they've co-authored papers with us. They're very much co-production partners, if I can use that term. And they also comment and advise on the information that's given to patients. And they review all of that patient interface documentation, anything that's patient facing, the consent forms, the information sheets, and the lay summaries that present results. If we go on again, David also went on to say that he felt they bring the patient voice, and that's what we feel as well. They bring the patient voice here. They report back the TMG concerns about what might work in practice, how it reflects against their experiences and the people they effectively represent. They've been involved in dissemination, let's say, article production, videos, and they've given talks. They give talks, they contribute to such discussions as well. They weren't able to get David with us today. And if we go on again, so David also said, what's it like to be a patient representative? And he said, in short, he said that their voices are heard. And that's great. That's what you want. That's what we want as investigators. We want the patients to be heard and to be part of this. He also felt that their input and their perspective was sought, that it was valued, and it was recognized in diverse ways. And I say, if he feels that way, that's great. That's what we're looking for. They feel an integral and important part of the Stampede trial. Brilliant. Let's move on to the next. What I wanted to show you is the information's got to be sufficient that people feel comfortable joining the trial, and people have joined Stampede. Every dot on here is a patient that's joined the trial. This is a variation on what you saw. There's now more than 11,000 patients that have joined the trial. You'll see how the density of the dots changes over time. When arms DNF stop recruiting, there are more people, there's still the same number of people coming in, but they're being allocated across the other arms. So you effectively boost recruitment to those. When we finish recruitments to the original comparisons, B, C, and E, you can see that then there's a period where we're only recruiting to A and G and H, and it's quite densely packed at that point, right? So you can see the people, you can see that shifting, but we only compare contemporaneously randomized patients. If you don't know that word, people who are randomized at the same time get compared. You'll also see the impact of COVID over 2020 while we were paused to recruitment. Let's move on again. This trial has produced practice-finding results 3 times so far, showing that chemotherapy is useful, showing that abiraterone is useful, and radiotherapy is useful for men with a low-risk metastatic disease. And when I say useful, I mean it's improved survival. And we've updated our standard of care on the back of this, including updating based on some early results we saw from using radiotherapy in non-metastatic patients. And there's practice-defining results about to come out in the Lancet as well, a new set that will be coming out, the proofs. We were looking at them this morning. And so if we go on one more time. So David, who's the man in the on the right in the picture on the top left, and Robin Millman, who's our other patient representative at the moment, they have been involved in helping us disseminate results. This is a video that we presented explaining the results of abiraterone. You'll notice that rather wonderful backdrop is not like my own here today, fake. That's actually the view from the old MRC head office before they had to downgrade. There'd been a fire in our building and we had to go and shoot with this wonderful backdrop. It's really quite distracting, I think, that lovely view over London. You'll also see Robin helping explain what multi-arm, multi-stage platform trials here are in the bottom left-hand corner. So doing a great job explaining the methodology and the principles, and that's there for clinical people and patient and public representatives. On the right-hand side here, this is a video that we put together about the results for radiotherapy. Kevin was one of the patients who participated in the trial. I've not dealt with Kevin directly. He was recruited for the video to talk about the experience of being in the trial as a participant by the lead investigator at one of the sites, Chris Parker, who was the comparison chief investigator for that. Brilliant contributions from all three of them, and you know, they speak the experience really well. If we go on again. So maybe we don't need to show this, but just to say that we have updated that standard of care on the back of those contributions. The standard of care within the trial changes to reflect what we think is happening outside. We're updating the standard of care for everybody in the trial and out of the trial, and that only happens because we did the trial, and we only managed to do the trial because people were willing to participate. So we always appreciate every single person that chooses to join a clinical trial. I don't meet them, I never get to talk to the patients who are in trials, but always appreciate every single one of them who chooses to do that. So if we go on one more time, we've been trying, yep, so that's updating our standard of care. We'll go on one more time. So we've been trying very hard to share our experience of implementing these platform protocols, including the statistical and the practical issues. And we've got some recommendations that are coming out very soon from not just from Stampede, but for some other now experienced trials groups in the UK. So that's one to watch out for, but there's not a huge amount in those, I don't think, about the PPI experience, and something that we really should be picking up on and talking to others about. So let's go on one more time. I just wanted to say that one of the places patient and public representatives appear as members of ethics committees, and platform protocols can be difficult for them. It's not been consistent in the UK whether an application to add a new comparison into an ongoing platform gets reviewed by a subcommittee or the full committee, what forms people fill in. So we ran some workshops for the Health Research Authority in the UK, which of course involves many patient and public members. And now there are guidelines. You can pick them up from our website. If you go on again, you probably go on again one more time. Yeah, great. And so, go back again. So thank you. And the HRA have updated their standard operating procedures as well, which is fantastic on the back of that. So guidance that helps them. Go on one more time. If you'll forgive me a very quick advertisement break, the International Clinical Trials and Methodology Conference is going to be running in Yorkshire, in north of England, next year. This is the biggest academic-led conference for clinical trials. We'd love to see more PPI representatives there. We had a small handful, maybe 10, who were able to join us of the 700 last time, all of whom were wonderfully engaged and found it very energizing. And we sort of want to make sure there's something for everybody. So do spread the word, feel comfortable and confident to come to such a meeting, or encourage others to come along. And I just wanted to raise this conference with you. I'll move on again, if we may. So in summary, I think I wanted to say that PPI involvement in any clinical trial is important. It's helpful to the production of high quality, relevant trials. I want to tell you that MAM's platform trials are a key tool. They're being increasingly used, and Noura will show you how, in efficiently improving outcomes for patients and the public. And good PPI involvement is even more important in platform trials. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Matt, and sorry for the incident with the formatting. And now I give the floor to Nuru for his presentation on patient engagement in Stampede and beyond. His presentation will complement the one from Matt. The floor is yours, Nuru.
Thank you, Valentina, and thank you, Matt, for setting the scene so beautifully. I'll just wait for my slides to come up, but I would just say it's a real pleasure to be invited to speak at this event today. And I'll be delighted to present just a short part of the work that I'm undertaking as part of my PhD at the MRC Clinical Trials Unit based in London, where we're looking at and I've been specifically focusing on the late phase use of these adaptive platform trials, but I appreciate they're used in the early phase as well as considerations for committees overseeing these trials, including patient and public involvement. Next slide, please. So Matt's already highlighted the many inefficiencies of using traditional approaches when you have multiple interventions that are worthy of investigation. Next, please. And we've seen that actually, if you have multiple interventions worthy of investigation for any disease area, actually investigating this in a multi-arm platform, it brings about many efficiencies. Next slide, please. And as Matt has highlighted, actually many people often highlight the fact that you can add in new interventions into a platform trial, but actually the key efficiency is using these interim analyses to decide whether your findings are sufficiently interesting, and actually you're able to stop recruitment to intervention arms where perhaps the findings aren't sufficiently interesting. And that allows you then to focus your resources on other interventions which might bring about benefit to patients. Next slide, please. And I think this is one of the really important sort of findings that I've had from my work so far is often depending on which country you're based in or which parts of the world you're based in, you might use different terms or different names, often to describe exactly the same thing. We're using today the term platform trials, but appreciate that in many parts of the world, you might hear the term living protocol, master protocol, MAMS protocol. And I think this would be a really important I think a really important area for us as patients, clinicians, statisticians, all people working in the field of clinical trials, to try and harmonize the terminology. So when we are all referring to the same thing, perhaps we use the same words as well. Next slide, please. And next, please. So indeed, I'm sure myself, like many of the others in the audience, will have heard the phrase that these platform trials, these MAMS trials, whichever term you want to use, are being more widely used. But the global uptake, particularly in the late phase setting, is not something that's been published before. And so the exact uptake was unknown. Next slide, please. And why is that important? Well, the reason I wanted to look into this is I felt that there'd likely be many lessons that could be learned across different disease areas. And particularly for myself, where I work in an area looking at bowel diseases, where we typically don't use these more efficient designs, I was quite keen to learn how could we bring back these new, more complex platform trials into our disease area to try and deliver more efficient trials. Next slide, next please. So I undertook a literature review, found no published work in this area, and then we registered this work. Next, please. And essentially, we've conducted a systematic review of the published literature, as well as a trial registry-based review. And this was up till the cutoff date of April earlier this year, at which point the work was then later submitted. Next slide, please. So in terms of the actual trials themselves, there are many potential trials identified that could meet this definition for a late phase adaptive platform trial using this multi-arm, multi-stage approach that Matt so beautifully described. Essentially, there were 62 trials that we found that met our sort of quite clear and defined criteria. Next slide, please. And what you can see here is that, and apologies that the slide seems to be, the formatting is slightly changed, but what we can see is that since the first late phase adaptive platform trial at the turn of the century, there was quite a slow uptake of this design. But actually, that's rapidly accelerated over the last few years. And in particular, that's been driven by COVID-19 and the COVID-19 platform trials, which you can see there in the red here on the right. Next slide, please. So just to orientate yourself for this graph, I've got on the x-axis the year, and on the y-axis the number of trials. And if you press next, please. What you can see is that over time, and we've sort of termed this a sort of a gardening hose pipe plot. If you imagine you're sort of gardening and watering your garden, that, as I said earlier, there was quite a slow uptake of this design initially, but it's been rapidly accelerated in the last few years. And there's some really interesting patterns that you can note. But I'll perhaps focus in on just a couple of those. I think one of the key things to note is that initially this design was predominantly used in the oncology setting to investigate interventions for different cancers. But actually what we've seen is that over time, it's been increasingly used in many other different disease areas, including neurology, dermatology, and infectious diseases, and many others. And indeed, since this work has been conducted, we're aware of many others that are currently either in development or due to be registered, including in other disease areas, for example, in postpartum hemorrhaging and many others. Next slide, please. In terms of the organizations leading these late phase platform trials, one of the, I guess, the comments, if not perhaps a criticism, is that perhaps they could only be led from Western countries and high income countries. And whilst that was certainly appeared to be true prior to the COVID pandemic, what we've seen is since the pandemic that these trials can be also led from lower and middle income countries as well. But if you press the next slide, please. And when we then look at recruitment to these platform trials, actually we can see this is very much a worldwide phenomenon. This is a well understood trial design, and actually any country, no matter if the high, middle or low income, is able to recruit to trials using these designs. Next slide, please. I'll just give a very brief highlight for some of the findings from our work, in that you'll often hear many people highlight the many benefits of using seamless designs when looking at platform trials. And that certainly does seem to hold true, where the majority of trials do seem to take this more seamless approach. I think a really interesting point, and perhaps we can explore this more in the discussion, is that clearly commercial involvement in platform trials is absolutely key and necessary. But what we have found is that actually many of these platform trials seem to be particularly successful when they're led by non-commercial organizations. And by that, I might mean universities, clinical trials units, and many others. And there are perhaps many reasons for that, which we can explore and discuss. I guess one reason might be that actually as an academic organization, it's quite easy, or much easier for you to get multiple commercial organizations contributing into a platform, where it's perhaps a lot harder to have one commercial company leading a trial and having multiple other commercial companies contribute to that platform. Certainly not impossible, but perhaps a bit more of a challenge. Next slide, please. And I think this is a really interesting point, in that many people highlight one of the big efficiencies of platform trials is the ability to add in new comparison arms over time to an ongoing platform. But actually, so far to date, very few of those platform trials have actually been able to add in new intervention arms. And there's likely to be a number of reasons for this. Again, we can, I'd be very keen for us to discuss this as a panel. There may well be practical and logistical challenges of adding in comparisons to an ongoing trial, but also you have to take these findings with a slight pinch of salt. As I've just highlighted earlier, many of these trials have only been registered and started recruiting in the last few years. So it may just be that they've just not had enough time to add in new comparison arms yet. Next slide, please. And next, please. So this slide was just to highlight that if you have the green trials as the non-COVID trials and the black trials as the COVID-19 platform trials, there doesn't really seem to be any association with initial estimated sample size and the ability to add in new intervention arms over time. Next slide, please. One of the other key things that I was really keen to explore was about the committees that oversee these clinical trials. Again, lots of different names, lots of different acronyms used in different parts of the world. If it's okay, I'll use the term Data Monitoring Committee, or DMC, but I appreciate that many different terms will be used around the world. And next slide, please. And in particular, there's been some really helpful work looking at data monitoring committees and some really helpful guidance issued by multiple different organizations and regulators over the last few years. But two key areas that have not really been covered in any detail by those guidance have been the use of more complex design trials and this question about patient and public involvement. And I'll use the term PPI if that's okay. Next slide, please. And next. Perfect. So one of the key issues has been that, particularly around more complex trials, is that there's an increasing awareness that adaptive designs and longer lasting platforms probably offer unique challenges to these committees that oversee data in clinical trials. But there's really been no focus today on what those challenges might be and actually how to overcome those challenges, particularly in terms of what the requirements might be for training and education. Also, from the PPI side of things, there's been an increasing and appropriate increase in patient and public involvement across almost all aspects of randomized clinical trials. However, and next please, one of the things we've seen is, aside from notable exceptions, it's actually been quite rare to see patient and public involvement on data monitoring committees. And one of the things that I was quite keen to explore in this was to explore this in a research context. Next please. And I'll just give a sort of some very brief highlight is that in that the first part of this project, I was able to help conduct 2 large global surveys. The top survey there is a group of individuals working in clinical trials, which we've named trialists. We had 375 individuals participating from many countries around the world. And then at the bottom, you have a survey of individuals who have self-identified themselves as patient and public involvement representatives. And this was 132 individuals that completed this survey. And next, please. And so perhaps it will come as no surprise to yourself that when patient and public involvement representatives were asked about the role of patient and public involvement for these committees, they felt that there was almost always or potentially a role for patient and public involvement. And I should say that this was although the vast majority of respondents reported never having been on a data monitoring committee themselves, I should say that much like many surveys, you have to look at the population who took part in the survey, and this was a very experienced group of patient and public involvement representatives. The vast majority of respondents had been on various different committees relating to clinical trials research, whether it be ethics committees, trial management groups, or so forth. So you may not get the same answer from individuals who've never had any involvement in clinical trials. Next, please. And one of the really interesting and perhaps surprising findings was one of the often highlighted challenges people talk about is the fact that maybe clinicians, statisticians, or others working in the clinical trials field, maybe they wouldn't be quite so keen or perhaps so supportive of patient and public involvement specifically on these committees that can sometimes handle quite complex data and have to make often quite difficult decisions. But our survey findings found actually that was not the case at all. And actually, the vast majority of respondents felt that there was potentially or possibly a role for patient and public involvement on these data monitoring committees. And a common comment is that it will be important to explore and publish findings on this in a research context. And I'd be really keen to explore more around this area in the discussions. I should say that this work is currently being prepared for publication. If there's anybody in the audience who feels that either themselves or they know of anyone else that would be keen to be a patient reviewer, would be very happy to hear from yourselves. We're very keen to be able to suggest to journals potential patient reviewers for this work when we do submit. Next slide, please. So I'll just finish by saying that we've looked at the uptake of these late phase platform trials. Next, please. And I should say that I think one of the really important messages is that we still know that the use of efficient clinical trial designs are still in the minority. However, the use of these more efficient adaptive platforms is becoming more common across different countries, across different disease areas, and across different organizations leading these platforms. I've briefly discussed about 2 large global surveys we've conducted on data monitoring committees, specifically with a focus on some of these more complex trial designs, such as platform trials, and about the role of patient and public involvement. And next, please. And I'm currently completing work where we're looking in far more detail to explore the role of data monitoring committees specifically for platform trials and about the role of patient and public involvement. and we hope that this helps inform future collaborative guidance on these topics. Next slide, please. So I'll just finish by saying thank you to all the supervisors, mentors and collaborators at the MRC Clinical Trials Unit who have played such a key role in this work that I've presented today. I'd be delighted to help answer any questions, and I really look forward to the discussion this afternoon. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Nuru and Matt. So I see we have a couple of questions, but I would keep them as we start the panel discussion now. And of course, Matt and Nuru will be joined by a really distinguished group of panelists, including Pat Furlong, who's the founding president and CEO of Parent Projects for Muscular Dystrophy, Violeta Stratinei, who's a secretary and core member for the Melanoma Patient Network Europe, Solange Corriol-Rowe, who's the senior director for regulatory affairs and policy in Europe at AstraZeneca, and Ariel Rosen, who's director of global patient insight and engagement at ICON. And feel free all to unmute yourself and switch on your cameras as we can now start the panel discussion. So I would start with really a nice breaking questions just to Ariel, Violeta, Solange, and Pat to share what's your experience in platform trials. What's your take on this specific design of trials? Maybe Ariel, would you like to start?
Sure. Hi, everybody, and thank you again for including me in this panel. My experience with platform trials is really from the patient perspective. What we do, the work that we do at ICON with our team is to engage patients, caregivers, loved ones in the design and optimization of clinical trial protocols. So whether that's presenting a platform trial design to a patient panel and asking for their feedback and really helping to develop not only the protocol design, but those educational materials and making sure that patients understand what this trial design looks like for them from a real world perspective. How does it reduce their burden? What are the expectations of patients, and what can they hope for if they choose to be enrolled in a clinical trial such as this design?
Thank you, Ariel. I would move on with Violeta.
Good afternoon, and thank you for inviting me. Just for some background, we are a European network of patients, families, patients, advocates, founded in 2013. In 2014, we already had our first European conference, the Trials We Want. The conference focused on research, of course, and clinical trial design, and the different views that patients and regulators have on the risk, or had on the risk in clinical trials in that time. The interest for research involvement, of course, came naturally, and I think this is the trend in each patient organization, because we wanted to see our people surviving. And in that time, my own sister was very sick in that time. And in that time, when we started in advocacy in melanoma, the survival in our disease was only 5% on chemotherapy, which changed very, very fast in the last, let's say, 9-10 years to 50% on the new therapies. So, of course, this period, we participated to the review of research project, both funded by academia and industry, and most of them were, unfortunately, randomized clinical trials. Our pivotal trials were randomized clinical trials. And now, just a personal consideration. Personally, I find it hard to focus on ethical issues that RCT's randomized clinical trials are posing, when in fact I wanted to be busy more with clinical trial design, because we all felt that this is the way to increase the quality of research. Another aspect we noticed was that was little space we had as organization to twist the design of these so-called gold standard trials in something more inclusive, because we felt we want something more inclusive. So now with the larger accessibility and development of NGS techniques and all genome sequencing, we obviously hope for a shift in cancer research, and adaptive platform trials could be one of the most promising way to design research in oncology.
Thank you, Violetta. And I will move on to Solange.
Thank you, Valentina. So hello, everybody. So it's really a pleasure to be with you today. So thanks for the invitation to discuss an important topic, not only from the clinical standpoint, the use and acceptance of those trial design, but also the importance of bringing the patient in this discussion. And I have to say, and also this was nicely shown by the speakers previously, there's a growing interest in those trials, in those design in particular. They have shown that they are specific domain where they have already shown their interest. And I have to say that recently we as industry had the opportunity to organize a multi-stakeholder workshop on complex trial design. That was in October, in early October. And I expect that very soon there will be a report available, which will help, sharing the discussion we've had. We are definitely, keen to disseminate the information, since, this will help with regard to the use and acceptance of those trials in drug development. And we are already looking at, what will be the next steps. So this is why the two-day discussion is quite important. And I have to say that as part of this workshop, which was a truly multi-stakeholder workshop involving all, the players in this in drug development, there was, a specific breakout session where we discussed patient involvement. And another one was also quite, interesting and complementary in a way, which was about education and training. And obviously, knowing the success of this discussion, we've already identified follow-up action activities, and no doubt that the discussion will be pursued on patient involvement, patient education and training. And it has been said as well, and this is acknowledged, that education and training will not be solely for patient. And it will be, for everybody involved. This was definitely, highlighted, more than once in our discussion. Nora, earlier on, you mentioned ethics committees. So there were colleagues, involved in our workshop, and definitely these are also colleagues that, would need to be educated, HTA bodies representatives, and even in industry, because there's always the need, to be able to, change the mindset, evolve, according to the evolution in science. So this is quite key that, we could be working together and we could look at what's next, but, together. This is very much important, so that, we can increase the use and acceptance of those trial design, which will be even better to address a very specific research question, and in particular in situation where those trials could be even more, you know, of interest.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Solange. Thank you,
Thank you.
Solange. And it's good to make this connection with the past events, focusing also on complex and trials and platform trials, because despite the fact that the platform trials have been in the scene for a while, they are not, the uptake is not so wide yet, and we need to gain more knowledge, more understanding. So we will for sure build some connections and try to build on the learning from your session. And now I would leave the floor to Pat for her statement and also sharing with us her experience in platform trials.
Sure, thank you. And thank you for inviting me to join this wonderful group of people talking about something very near and dear to my heart. So I represent PPMD, or Parent Project Muscular Dystrophy. We're an organization, advocacy organization in the United States focused on Duchenne muscular dystrophy. We have done considerable work around thinking through trials by collecting some data, and I'll just set the stage with some of the data that we found. As we see Duchenne muscular dystrophy, 20 years ago, there was a law passed in the United States called the Muscular Dystrophy Care Act that resulted over those 20 years in a significant investment by the US government in Duchenne research, more than $800 million. And then that created sort of the tipping point for industry to become very interested in Duchenne muscular dystrophy. The disease is fairly well characterized with a gene and a protein product, and we certainly know the pathophysiology of this disease. We also, by this piece of legislation, established standards of care published in the Lancet in 2010 and updated in 2018. So we felt we had set the stage in terms of what we knew about this disease, and the standard of care has been in place now. We also developed with the CDC an ICD-10 code so that we could collect data appropriately on this disease, as the previous ICD-10 code or ICD-9 code really included all muscle diseases, which made it very difficult to isolate this predominant but single disease out of those. So what we did is some analysis on first of all, we have now more than 40 companies working on either replacing this protein with a smaller one, microdystrophin, or expressing it through an antisense oligonucleotide. And then companies looking at the downstream, such as antifibrotics, anti-inflammatories, et cetera. And so looking at all of this, we first asked the question, how long does it take for a site to open, an academic site to open to establish a clinical trial? What we learned in the United States, it's an average of between 2 and 22 months to set up a clinical trial, get through all of the processes that are required, the IRB, the contract negotiation, et cetera, as well as the burden of trials that this institution might have. So time, again, 2 to 22 months, in a disease that is progressive, where these young boys impacted by the disease lose function over time. That was the first thing. The second thing that we really looked at is, what is the average age of inclusion in a clinical trial? And sadly, in clinical trials, at least that we've seen, the primary target for recruitment in trials is people who are ambulatory. In this disease, in general, by the time you are 10 to 13 years old, you are not going to be ambulatory. So you're looking at a very targeted population, while the rest, either very young, who usually below the age of 5, are unable to participate in trials. And then we'll say over the age of 12, based on their loss of ambulation, cannot participate in trials. Again, time. So patients would have to wait until such a clinical trial produced results, went through the regulatory process, and then became, if approved, obviously available. So with those two issues in mind, and the fact that we had 40 companies and growing, looking at opportunities that should be explored in this disease, we felt the time was right to think about a clinical trial. Because as we imagine clinical trials and describe them today, each company sets up their own house, essentially building the infrastructure in the house. And at the end of the trial, with whatever happens in a trial, that house is taken down. So our view was, couldn't we set up a master protocol, or couldn't we build an apartment building where there was inclusive, so it would be inclusive of the entire population, where there was, as Matt described, subset analysis, that you could take a specific portion of those patients and take a look at them in the interim, in the middle of things, and see how things were doing. And we felt like if we could establish a master protocol, then as we figure out what therapies are going to be useful in this population and get them approved, then the labeling, the FDA in our case writes the label that would be broad based on the safety data of the inclusion criteria of all patients, and then the benefit as the analysis of the specific population. So we started working on a master protocol 3 years ago. We first met with our patients and families to describe what it is and why it is and what it means. What we learned from there is their concern, because as a patient with a rare disease, seeing any number of trials, often you get your heart set on this particular trial is likely to confer benefit on the person I care about. So it felt like you're taking away choice. And in fact, you are in a randomized, in a master protocol, but what you get back is maybe a yes or no more quickly, more inclusive protocol, sites get up and running more quickly. So we felt like the benefit risk here was worth evaluating. We then met with our academics and our patients again, and companies to share and understand their interest. As we began to work on this, setting up various committees and work streams, we then teamed up with a group out of the United States called iAct for Children. The iAct is pediatric centers of excellence in the United States, and we map those against our certified centers. So a subset of centers where we are now in process. We've had a regulatory meeting, which is called a Type B meeting with FDA, and we are now reaching out at one more time because we have the Type B meeting completed. The notes are back from the FDA. So now our next step is severalfold. One is we've talked to the ALS community who have set up and are working in a master protocol that is working quite well to understand their challenges, what was easy, what was hard, what are the pain points. We are now meeting with a very subset of experts, to include some in Europe, because we think if we're setting up a master protocol on a rare disease, we should do it internationally. And then we will then, once again, bring the stakeholders together, which are patients primarily, in our view, the priority for us, academics who are in our certified centers, who would be clinical sites, the companies that are involved, the FDA in our case, and hopefully the EMA as we reach out, and then the payers, so that we all are on the same page. We understand each stakeholder's willingness, their challenges, their concerns, and we address those going forward. So that's where we are, and we're prepared to set up the infrastructure. And on all things, we have patient representatives on all work streams, and they will be part and parcel of our data safety monitoring group.
Thanks a lot, Pat. Actually, I wanted everyone to give also an overview of their experience in platform trials, also to show how big is the potential for these trials, what's the benefit they can bring to patients, and clearly timely involvement is one of the key aspects, as I understand. But one of the aspects we want to discuss today is really when it comes to patient engagement in the platform trials. Do you identify any major differences in patient engagement strategies in platform trials compared to standard trials? I'm asking this because this topic is very close to our heart. We need to work in the UPair project, which is an IMI project, and bring new tools eventually, if we identify them as really needed, to support patients and also other stakeholders engaging with patients in platform trials. And feel free to respond. I mean, this is an open to all the panelists.
Well, I guess, Valentina, of course, this is quite a good question, and you already mentioned that there are, here and there, some information, that could be of help. And clearly, there's a need to connect the dots and to really identify the needs of, everybody involved, including the patient. So this is why, you know, it's important to look at what is existing, what is missing, and this is where, you know, I would value more work and interaction, you know, not only as a result of the workshop I mentioned, you know, previously, but also based on experience so far, experience of sponsors, experience of a patient, and Pat's experience is great. And because you detailed, you know, quite nicely from the zero, you know, to interaction with the regulators, you know, what has been experienced. So this is, you know, very important to consider, and to be able, you know, at the end of the day, to provide important learnings which will pave the way to education and, you know, further use and acceptance of those trials. Thank you.
Thank you, Solange.
I think feeding off Solange and Pat, your experience as well, in developing the patient materials, it's important to recognize the differences in patient health literacy. When we're thinking even simple clinical trial design, a lot gets lost from the study coordinator in the site over to the patient when they're having conversations with the patients and the families. As the complexity increases, as it does with platform design, patients are going to have increasing numbers of questions. However, most patients, especially those outside of the rare disease and the oncology space, may never have had a clinical trial opportunity presented to them by a physician, by a member of their care team. And most of those patients may not even know what questions to ask when faced with those questions. So really, in developing the materials, it's important to think through from an advocacy standpoint, from a patient standpoint, where are those knowledge gaps so we can really address that in the materials that are developed. I loved the example that Matt presented earlier where it was a staged approach. I think that's really important because, to his point, some patients want, you know, information overload. They're already going onto Google, they're already digging in themselves, and so they really want a large amount of information. Other patients don't. Other patients really want to have a smaller amount of information that they're digesting over time. It's about repetition. It's about also who's presenting it and in the way that it's presented. We found in a lot of the work that we've done with patients and with developing educational materials, there's still a fine balance between digital platforms for developing information and presenting it and the standard paper printout that you're getting at your doctor's office. Especially when we're talking about pediatric and adolescent trials, there's also a need to consider how information is being presented to the parent as compared to the patient, and what the needs are developmentally in terms of those kids who are participating in trials. So again, I think that there's a lot that needs to be done in terms of that educational approach when it comes to complex trial design.
These are very relevant, you know, comments, Ariel. Thanks so much. And indeed, it was mentioned that within IMI EU Pearl, there's, you know, consideration of training material, but similarly, you know, I could mention another IMI project, which is Trials at Home, and where we are also looking at putting together training material, and of course we've raised, you know, similar issues, concern, and in particular also one that you mentioned with regard to pediatrics. And I remember as well that in another initiative where, you know, we've been developing guidance on how to return study results to patients. This is exactly, you know, the same points that, you know, we raised and we considered. And as you probably know, Valentina, you were part of this initiative as well. This guidance that we developed having, you know, the opportunity to develop them in a multi-stakeholder environment, we were quite lucky, you know, further to solid interaction with the European Commission to have, you know, this guideline be endorsed by the Commission, and it's now part of Udralex Volume 10. So clearly something to consider, but it's not the end of the day, since there will be, you know, still opportunity to have this document be modified, be improved with experience gained, and definitely we are far from being, you know, oh, that's fine, everything is fine, everything, you know, is ready and completed. No, it's only right, you know, we are right at the beginning. So all the same consideration, you know, whether it is to report back on the study results, or I mean to involve, you know, patient throughout drug development. So thanks for this.
So can I come in with a point? You asked about information to participants, and I think that's, you know, it's really important, both thinking about the start and the end. I mean, at one point, I've forgotten who used the term, but often platform trials get grouped together under complex clinical trials or complex designs. I hate that word. The point is, for the participant, it shouldn't seem complex. You know, what we're doing is something efficient. We're doing something that's useful. Complex is a negative word, and I don't think that's the right approach. So you can give the right amount of information to somebody without overwhelming them. Even in a stratified medicine trial where people really are quite tailored to where they're going, it's appropriate. There's a question, so you can tailor that information up front. You could do that in a good way. You can stage that. And at the end, I do think there is a particular challenge in a platform trial where there are lots of results. Who do you give the results to? Do you give the results to the people from the comparison that they contributed to? If they're allocated to research arm B, you know, when you report the results of B against arm A, then I think it makes sense. They get the results from that. That should be a minimum. But actually, what about the other comparisons that they didn't get recruited to that were open at the same time? Should they get those results? I'd want them. As I said, my father, who didn't want anything, would not want to know those. What about the comparisons that came before or the comparisons that came after? Should they get that information? How do we stage who gets what information? I don't think we've got a good sense of that. So who knows what and when they should know it, I think is a really live issue where we should know more results. I've just put in the chat the findings from the Show Respect study, which is a randomized trial looking at some ways of giving data back to participants. We think this is a first randomized trial of evidence of how to give participants information back from a trial. We need to build on that.
Thank you, Matt, and everyone else for responses. Yes,
Yeah,
one last comment from Solange.
Oh,
Yeah,
And
sorry. Just to answer what Matt was saying with regard to the term complex. Well, it's just, you know, Matt, an overarching term encompassing, as you know, all the others, meaning all possible design which are not standard, you know, meaning randomized controlled trials, and of course, meaning platform trials, basket trials, umbrella, and others. So clearly, I will keep your remark in mind. Thank you, Matt.
Thank you. Violeta, would you like to make a comment?
Yeah. I will just go a little bit away from this informing approach, because informing doesn't mean for us patient involvement, and we should be very clear that there are patients advocates, there are patient advocates experts, and there are people, and I agree with the panelists that there are different needs, and we should very well think what really mean where we can change something. And you ask us, have you identified any difference between patient engagement? Well, my experience, as I said, is limited, but I think the biggest difference is that simply they are not there. This new methodology, these platform trials, they are not there. And in order to make them happen, you should push in time. You should be there to push in time the switch between the methodology. For that, we need to be present into the discussion even before the project is drafted, either in the conception phase, even if in the moment when nobody has no idea of the need of the project that they are going to set up. So, for example, we had this frustration in melanoma because like this, if you cannot switch the methodology, if you have in front of you a protocol, you cannot do very much. It's already drafted. People will not delete one sentence from that protocol. So, for example, we had in melanoma this trial for stage 2. These are people with good prognosis, as maybe you know, and even without treatment, they are with good prognosis, and only around 20%, let's say, are in danger to get metastatic. But what we don't know why and who will progress, unfortunately. So the real question for us was here, not if treatment A is better than placebo, but whom of these people are more likely to get metastatic and need the treatment in order to spare the long-term toxicity for the other 80%. So this was the question on the lips of everybody. And everybody knew that this is the real question. But at the end, what we got a randomized clinical trial. This question we knew that would fit probably into maybe adaptive platform trial driven by stratification biomarker, patched with translational research, but not in the randomized clinical trial. And despite this rationale, we got RCT with disappointing results, and the therapy probably will be difficult to reimburse in Europe. That means that therapy will not reach the patient. So once again, in order to get a radical change in research, we need to get into the conversation before even the sponsor dream about that project.
Thank you, Violetta. I think this is a common challenge we face both in standard trials and complex clinical trials. It's a similar trend. I would like to raise a question for Pat that was shared by Russell Wheeler before we move on to the next question. And it's about rare diseases. Russell shares that until now, platform trials have been thought to be unworkable for rare diseases trials because there is insufficient patient enrollment and or candidates for different treatment arms. Can you comment on this, because you represent also a specific rare disease?
Sure, and thanks for the question. But Duchenne is certainly not an ultra rare disease. There are about, in the United States, a guesstimate, because we don't have adequate surveillance on all patients, about 12,000 patients with Duchenne muscular dystrophy. So there are any number, and again, a guesstimate of about 250,000 people worldwide. So it is not one of the ultra rare diseases. And you're right, in some cases, it may not be possible in the ultra rare or in some rare diseases. But in our disease, we feel like there is sufficient pathways that are drugs that are being developed, or for that matter, gene therapies. Now we have about 6 companies that are looking at delivering a microdystrophin with an AAV virus. And so I think it is not for all trials, clearly, and it may be for phase 2 trials versus phase 3 trials. It may be for downstream versus trials that are looking at dystrophin replacement with an AAV gene therapy approach. But I think it has a place here, and this is exactly why we're coming to our families, our academics, all of our stakeholders, payers, FDA, et cetera, to say, are there efficiencies here that could be applied, that we could that we could apply or utilize here? I know that the gene therapy companies have reached out to us, as well as the antisense companies that are looking to express the protein. That would be a little different mechanics, because that would be mutation dependent in both cases, as some of the protocols of gene therapy have been amended. So I think there's a lot of complexities here, but I do think there's a place for them to reduce burden and increase inclusion and have some efficiencies here. We are still, this is a work in progress. We are getting consultants all along the way. So I think the bottom line answer is, No, it is not a one size fit all. In some cases, it makes sense. I think you have to look at the data and see where it makes sense. You have to engage your stakeholders to figure out where and when and how it makes sense. But I do think there are efficiencies if we can get fundamentally centers working together. If we can get a centralized IRB, if we can get centralized contract negotiation, at least that you could get sites up and running more quickly than 2 to 22 months. So it may be that we have a hybrid of this going forward as we think in rare disease, but I certainly think that time is the commodity for patients. They are losing function every day. And I think that if we can make trials more efficient, less burdensome, centralized contracting, centralized IRB, I think we will be a full step ahead, plus the interim analysis to make sure, just as an example, in the United States, we have a trial that's gone on that has not gotten to a regulatory decision with a 10-year extended access program. You know, this is really heartbreaking for so many patients because they're sort of in this Sophie's choice. Do they withdraw the drug and find out it works and see more decline in the people they care about, or what? Because if they don't stop that drug and wash out, they can't participate in other clinical trials. So I think that there are certainly challenges here, but certainly a desire to think through how we can do things better, faster, more efficiently, and save time for patients.
Thank you, Pat. I redirect the same question to Matt.
Yeah,
and
so
Nuro, if you want to add anything.
I think it is possible to use these designs in certain rare diseases. It partly depends on on chronic conditions versus progressive conditions. That could be different because you've got almost in a progressive condition, you've got one opportunity to join a trial. If you're got a trial only for patients with newly diagnosed cancer, for example, then people aren't going to be part of that if they're 2 or 3 years down the line, right? Whereas in a chronic condition, the multiple sclerosis or something, there are other opportunities to participate. So the pool is different. So we did manage to design a study for patients with osteosarcoma. We've run a trial called EUROMOS-1. Osteosarcoma is about 5 in 100,000 people, mostly affects kids, early teens, young adult, responsible for a large proportion of life years lost. Grim. But through international collaboration, we managed to run the largest trial. We managed to recruit just over 2,000 patients to a trial, which everybody thought that was infeasible for doing. So we realized there were 3 questions we wanted to ask after that. And we could factorialize those questions because they were asking different things. So you could expand out. We worked out we could run an 8-arm trial. Because the people don't do very well, it was information rich. When you power clinical trials, it's not just about the number of people, but about the amount of events that happen. And even with good treatment, we were still going to see events, unfortunately, in these patients. But we worked out that we'd be able to address all 8 of these questions with fewer than 2,000 people using a multi-arm, multi-stage platform approach to drop in extra things. So we could do it even in that rare condition, but the international collaboration was the important thing. It didn't get off the ground. The biggest partner in that decided they thought their sites on the ground weren't ready for a multi-arm, multi-stage trial. We're talking 8 years ago, and maybe they weren't at that point, which is a real shame. They went off and tried to design a traditional 2-arm trial, which they took to their funder, who said it wasn't exciting enough, so they didn't get to do that either. The irony.
Thank you, Matt. And with this, I would move on to the next question that is mainly for Nuro, Ariel, and Solange. And I'd like to ask if you have noticed any major differences in how platform trials work for different diseases. I hear that they may work better for certain diseases rather than others. They may be more efficient for some rather than others, but feel free, Nuro, to start.
Yeah, thank you, Valentina. And I think this is an excellent question. What are the similarities and differences? What lessons can you take across platform trials, across different disease areas? I think this is of great interest to academia, to industry, to patients. I think everybody involved in clinical trials. I think the key thing, and I think Matt really highlighted this really well, is in terms of similarities, essentially, if there's any medical condition where there are multiple interventions worthy of investigation, and for many medical conditions that does appear to be the case nowadays, then it absolutely makes sense to investigate them in a multi-arm platform rather than performing lots of individual 2-arm trials. And that's very obvious to see the sort of huge efficiency gains you get from that approach. So I think that's the key in terms of similarities between across these disease areas. Whenever there's multiple interventions that you have worthy of investigation, it really is worthwhile trying to put together and assess these in a multi-arm platform. Matt's already alluded to some of the challenges of why that might not be possible to do in different disease areas, but it's certainly, I think, worth the effort. In terms of differences between trials, and I'll try and give a sort of higher level answer, and I'd be really keen to hear thoughts from the other panelists. I guess the big notable difference across different disease areas is the outcome measure. Okay, so we know that the outcome measure is critically important for any clinical trial, and historically people always use the phrase, you know, it has to be an outcome measure important to patients, the clinicians, the regulators, and all the other important stakeholders. And this is obviously completely different across different disease areas. And we highlighted earlier that, you know, the key efficiency of using this platform trial approach is using these interim analyses where you can see, do you have any sufficiently interesting data to support a benefit for the intervention or not? Now, obviously, this depends a lot on what you use as your outcome measure. And if I put, and certainly Matt will be able to talk in far greater detail on this, but if you take the example from prostate cancer and of the STAMPEDE platform trial, their definitive outcome measure for the trial was to see if there was an overall survival benefit for the intervention. And this obviously is clearly something that you imagine is important to patients, clinicians, regulators, industry, and many others. However, it takes many years before you see an overall survival benefit of most interventions for prostate cancer, and indeed most other cancers. So actually, you can't really use overall survival as an interim outcome measure to see if you've got early benefit from a treatment, because you're just not going to see an overall survival benefit so early on. So what the STAMPEDE trial has used as their interim outcome measure is progression-free survival. So whether your cancer progresses or not, to give an indication, a signal for whether actually this treatment might be beneficial or not, to then see if there's a later benefit in overall survival. And then looking at different disease areas, different disease areas have used different interim and definitive outcome measures, if I can use those terms. Just to give an example of the disease area that I work in, where people focus on diseases of the bowel, we've often used as our sort of main outcome measure in clinical trials endoscopic appearances. So you go in with a camera test to see whether things have got better or not after giving the intervention. And typically, I'm talking about here about medical drug interventions, but this could be any intervention, surgery, non-pharmacological, whatever. But again, you can imagine that you can't use this as an interim outcome measure. You can't repeatedly ask people to drink bowel preparation and have repeated camera tests to see whether your intervention is working or not. That's just not feasible. No patients are going to like that or want to do that. So actually, even though that might be an appropriate definitive outcome measure at the end of your trial to satisfy regulators, industry, clinicians, and so forth, actually a much better interim outcome measure is likely to be something much more patient-friendly, something non-invasive, like an ultrasound scan, or maybe a blood test or a stool test. So I think that's the biggest difference that I've seen across different disease areas. And I think it's one of the reasons why there are many similarities between platform trials, but it's really key that you have disease and specialty experts if you're designing a platform trial in a completely new area. So I apologize if that's a slightly long answer, but I'd be really keen to hear the thoughts from others on the panel.
Thank you. So Ariel and Solange, if you would like to add anything.
Well, of course, I welcome what Nora said, you know, with regard to not only the statistical issues, the methodological issues, the operational issues, of course, linked to those trials. But this can be overcome with, you know, a very nice pre-planning. So let's take the time, you know, to think of what, you know, has to be planned, and to think of, you know, starting the study, having in mind already, you know, the end of it. So this is quite important. So when you are saying which situation, just look at, you know, what the IMI EU Pearl project is focusing on. So they are focusing on tuberculosis, neurofibromatosis, NASH, and also major depression. So these are quite, of course, interesting condition, knowing that as it was, shown previously, of course, oncology is, an important part where, those trials have been initiated. So, and of course, as you know, most of the pediatric oncology indication are rare diseases. So clearly, this is where, the focus is at the moment, knowing that with more experience gain, there will be, of course, more appetite, science-driven, interest to look into other situations. Thank you.
Thank you, Solange. I will now move to a question to Matt. We hear that one of the potential benefits for patients enrolled in platform trials is that in case of withdrawal of one arm, enrolled patients in this arm can join other arms. Can you explain how this works? I mean, practically, I mean, if you were a relative of one of those patients, how would you like to hear this information?
Okay, so the concept of re-randomization is increasingly acted upon. And so firstly, you could probably only join up with the study again if you still meet all of the eligibility criteria. So as I mentioned before, if you've got a trial for patients with newly diagnosed cancer, and the treatment that they were on is not one of the ones that's going to continue to recruit, well, by the time you know that information, that could be 3 months, that could be 6 months, that could be 5 years down the line, then they're no longer a newly diagnosed patient. So they wouldn't be able to be re-randomized in that setting, but they're still followed up, they'd still be contributing, they're still helping other people. Trials may help us, but it definitely helps other people, right? That's one of that individual versus societal equipoise issues, balance issues. So, in that instance, that wouldn't be possible. But in a more chronic condition, then it may be possible to re-randomize patients with some form of sort of washout period, some gap, providing that they still meet the eligibility criteria. Now, we did do this in Stampede. I showed you that 2 of the arms stopped early for lack of benefit, arms D and F, if you were wanting the letters from the graph. There we had a couple of patients who were randomized just about the time that they were randomized a couple of days before we stopped treatment, before we stopped allocating patients. They were randomized a couple of days before, and they still met the eligibility criteria, and they hadn't really started the treatment they've been allocated to yet. So we felt it was better to withdraw them and enter them as if they were a new patient, because they were willing to join. We felt that was the fairest thing to do. But for the other patients who are further out, in that instance, we couldn't. There will be other research that they could participate in the future. They've contributed, they're helping other people. That was important.
Okay. Thank you so much. And I will move on to, I think, the final questions as we are heading towards the end. And I want to give the floor to everyone to speak on this point. As EPF, and together with our colleague in this task in UPER Novartis, we are working on a platform that will host material and guidance on patient engagement in platform trials. And really our question to all of you is, what is the tool that you would recommend us to develop? What's where is the urgency in your opinion and based on your experience? And anyone can start, maybe Pat, as you have experience with the platform trials already.
Oh gosh, I think that the very first approach must be to engage your community and all stakeholders. I think you need to inform not only in our disease, the patients and families, but all stakeholders, the academics, the PIs who will be participating in this, the companies who may or may not have interest in this, and certainly the regulatory agencies. Because fundamentally what you want to get to for those research opportunities that bring benefit to patients, you want to get to approvals and access to them. So I think the first is engaging the stakeholders in your community and informing them, and then really trying to figure out, as Ariel said, how best to explain this in terms of print materials or online materials or videos, or what is the most comprehensive way, what are the needs and gaps of your community, so that you can educate not just the people who show up, but all the people who will be going to these clinics and be likely engaged in this process.
Thank you, Pat. Ariel?
Absolutely, and thank you, Pat, for setting that up so nicely. So I agree. I think really understanding who the stakeholders are and what their informational needs is vitally important. I think also recognizing that there is going to be variation and cultural nuance in terms of health literacy and uptake of information. And so for these large global trials, really making sure that we understand what the needs and importantly, the unmet needs of these patient populations are and their families. Again, especially if we're talking about rare disease and oncology and pediatric trials, it really is a family decision, and the informational needs and kind of the developmental stage of these patients is going to be very different. I also think that it's really important to recognize that patients, to Pat's point, patients that we may be engaging with through advocacy groups and through some of patient panels are really the superheroes. They may know more about their indication than the clinicians do. They may not also represent the real world patient who does not understand and have the same level of health literacy that those highly engaged, highly health literate patients have. So there needs to be a balance in terms of the amount of information and the accessibility of that information. I also think that making sure that the study sites themselves are really well coached and well trained in how to use those tools and materials. So often the suite of materials, the box of materials, back when I used to be a study coordinator, the actual box of materials arrived at the study site and the coordinators didn't know what to do with it. They didn't know how best to engage with that patient, how to talk to that parent, how to have a consenting conversation, and how to ask questions and answer questions. So it's also about providing those sites with coaching and materials and talking points that really can further the conversation with patients as they consider trial enrollment.
Thanks a lot, Ariel and Violeta.
Thanks for the opportunity. So I will try to be very short. First, I think I agree with everybody. We need education, and I will propose an educational resource for everybody: researcher, patient organization, HTA regulators, and payers, because many times we just miss them from the discussion. Something like essential about adaptive platform trials with links to up-to-date references. Second, I'll be very concrete here. Based on our experience in Melanoma Patient Network Europe, I will just start a series of how to read and review such a protocol. These are more challenging protocol. We can call them complex or not. So I will say how to read and review platform trial protocol and what points one patient advocate needs to pay attention during the review, and how to interpret data coming from adaptive platform trials. I have another proposal that it's referring to the public research funders. New criteria according to which research is funded. First, making the patient involvement possible across Europe, because it's not happening everywhere in Europe, this is clear. And then making the condition for patient involvement more nuanced and more concrete. For example, offer points or incentive for involvement with real impact in the protocol. Because dissemination, my dear colleagues, doesn't mean that you are influencing the protocol, actually, the clinical design. Dissemination means that you disseminate the results, or we speak very nice about what happened already. So we really should check where we can make changes. And the last about what is coming from European Union, I think I am fed up because I am in a free European project, and we should change the key performance indicators there at the European project. And actually, patient organization and also research organization are too busy spending time measuring, accounting how many tweets they have, how many Facebook posts about the results. So then forgetting what they are really in that project for. So this was my point. Thank you.
Thank you. And then Solange, very quickly, because we are going to close.
Yeah, well, I think that, of course, we've done a lot, but a lot is, ahead of us. And it's all about, for me, about collaboration and the use of, all what is at our disposal at the moment, to increase patient involvement and patient engagement, but also dissemination of the information, education using, of course, all digital technologies, that could be of help, knowing that more and more we will have to work together, and we will have to show as well, as sponsors, what has been, the added value of bringing, patient into this discussion. So clearly this is something, that the regulators would like to understand, at the end of the day. So I'm looking forward to having even more, valuable interaction, since, input of everybody, including patient, is paramount in drug development. Thank you.
Thank you, Solange. Nuro or Matt, would you like to add anything to what was already said?
I could perhaps go briefly and then perhaps let Matt have the last word. I think I would just echo everything everyone said, and particularly one of the key messages coming across from the patient engagement work and the interviews that I've been involved in is this point about the lack of training and education on offer, and that people are consistently saying they would value training and opportunities to learn more about platform trials to get involved. I think the key thing is not disease-specific training, because patients are already experts in their medical condition, having had the lived experience, but it's the training around the different committees that oversee trials, what information those committees might have to consider, the challenges that come from being on a role of, for example, a data monitoring committee. These are the areas that patients are consistently sort of saying in the interviews that I've been conducting, that's the areas that they'd like training and education in. And I think that would be great if that could be developed.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I'd agree. More training for site staff. We can talk about what goes in writing, but actually how it's managed, the information that gets to potential participants and people who are in trials, I think is really important. That can be quite specific to platform protocols, but just generally a greater awareness of clinical trials for participants. The government briefings in the UK in the last 2 years have meant that everybody in the UK is aware of clinical trials. There's no damn money left to fund the things, but people are aware of trials. I'm not sure they necessarily understand them, but we know that the one time to learn about medical research methods is not when you've just been diagnosed with a disease, right? So more general awareness, I'd love to see that out there, and I'm probably preaching to the converted in this group.
Thank you. Thank you all for your contribution and for your insights. I'd like now to conclude this session, so we are already a bit late. Next slide, please. Maybe, I don't know, something is blocked, but wanted just to share that we are going to have a satisfaction survey, so all participants may contribute. It takes only 3 minutes. Next one, please. This session is going to be followed by the final one of the Patient Engagement Open Forum for 2021. And the session will be about global lens on evolving patient engagement landscape, co-creating PEOF 2022. So all those who want to attend have also a chance to influence the program for 2022. And with this, I'm going to close this session. Thank you everyone for your participation, to the audience for staying with us. And I'm sorry if I couldn't respond to all the questions that were raised, but I've seen Matt and other panelists have been very active in the chats. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a nice rest of the day.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. That was
want us
very
to hang
useful
around for a
and
second?
interesting. Thank you.
Valentina, I thought it was an interesting session. Well done. Thank you for getting me involved.
Thank you for making it.
And I enjoyed being with all the panelists. Thank you.